everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to Faux Feminism: Why We Fall for White Feminism and How We Can Stop. A conversation with authors Serene Khader, Zeus Eugene, and Cindy Lynn. My name is Aliyah Ranjit Singh, and I'm an assistant professor in the Africana Studies Department and the Caribbean Studies program at Brooklyn College. And I'm also on the Wolf Institute's advisory board for the 2024-2025 academic year. And with the Wolf and the Brooklyn College community, I'm very happy to host this conversation and, of course, to celebrate Professor Khader's new book. So this event is part of a 7-part series the Wolf Institute is hosting to celebrate books by Brooklyn College faculty. We invite you to join us this Thursday, March 20th at 6 p.m. online for a celebration of Professor Megan Ferentz's book, Matutu Work, Gender, Labor, and Mobility in Nairobi. And the information on this and other book events will be posted in the chat, so look out for that link in the chat. I also want to invite you to join us the first week of April for HES Week 2025, a series of events organized to honor the work of this year's HES Scholar in Residence, Melissa Murray, professor at NYU School of Law, co-host of the Strict Scrutiny podcast, and a legal analyst and host at MSNBC. So 26 speakers, 7 public events, and 4 days. Urgent conversations with leading legal scholars on abortion and democracy, the use of history by the courts, the future of individual rights, the role of the courts in our democracy, podcasting, and of course, our collective future. So we are very excited for these events and hope you will join us. And of course, the schedule for this you should see in the chat as well. I also want to remind you that this event is being recorded and will be housed on the Wolf Institute's YouTube channel. So now to the speakers. Professor Serene Khader holds the Jay Newman Chair in Philosophy of Culture and is Professor of Philosophy at Brooklyn College and the CUNY Graduate Center. She is the author of 3 books in feminist, moral, and political philosophy, and her public-facing work can be found in venues such as the New York Times and the New Republic. Zeus Eugene is a philosophy graduate from Binghamton University, specializing in critical theory, social philosophy, continental philosophy, and ethics. They focus on reification, cultural and social analysis, and political and legal theory, exploring how societal structures shape human experiences. Then Cindy Lynn. Cindy Lynn is an undergraduate senior at Brooklyn College, majoring in political science. She loves to discuss political and feminist theories that challenge societal norms and promote new ways of thinking about world issues and solutions. She plans on becoming a physician focused in primary care and women's health. Her favorite activities to do in her free time are editing videos and building paper theaters. So welcome again. I'm Professor Khader. I hand it over to you. And again, congratulations.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Professor Ranjit Singh, and for moderating us tonight, and also to Professor Alonso for everything that you have done to organize this. Folks who read the book will find out that it is largely about unseen labor. So I want to take a moment to thank Professor Alonso for everything that you have done. One of my great honors in my career is to have wonderful students like Cindy and Zeus, who were both in my feminist philosophy class last semester. Or 2 semesters ago, I suppose. So our plan for today is basically that I'm going to give a sort of very short introduction to the book, maybe 10 minutes or so. And then Cindy and Zeus will each speak for about 5 minutes, and then they'll ask me a couple of questions, and then we will hope to have more of a conversation with all of you. But I'll start out by sharing a little bit about kind of what the book is about. Let me share my screen. Great. Is my screen sharing is okay? Okay. All right. I want to start out just by sharing a little bit about why I wrote this book and sort of what my overall thesis in it is. So I had kind of 2 major goals in writing the book. The first one, and I should say this is my first book for a non-academic audience. My other two books are kind of very clearly works of academic scholarship intended for other people with PhDs who are who are working on PhDs. This work is really different, and part of the reason I wrote it is that throughout my academic career, and even in my activist career before I went into academia, folks would always ask me, well, what's a good book to kind of give to a young person to introduce them to feminism? And what I felt is that the version of that book that I wanted to see really wasn't out there. So one reason I wrote this book was to write a book that's kind of an introduction to feminism, or that would work as an introduction to feminism, but that had at its center the stories and concerns of non-elite women. So that said, feminism has always been partly a movement that has been led by women of color, women in the global South, women in the labor movement. And I wanted to put these at the center of the story instead of to make these stories that people discover years into their familiarity with feminism. The second reason that I wrote the book is, and I wish I could do a show of hands. It's harder to do in Zoom than in a regular room. But will people raise their hands if they've heard the word white feminism before or the term white feminism? Okay. So I think many of us have heard that term before. Almost everyone is raising their hand. But uh-oh, what happened here? I lost my slide. Okay. I was looking at all of your hands. But I think most of the information that is available, sort of defining this term or explaining what we should do about it, is really in 140 character format in tweets. And I think without a clear understanding of what white feminism and these other feminisms for the few, without a better understanding of what makes them wrong, it's kind of hard for us to have a better political vision. So part of what I wanted to do is just, because I'm a philosopher, right? So a lot of my skill is in offering clearer definitions of things and in talking explicitly about values. So another part of what I wanted to do is just say, okay, a lot of us are talking about things like white feminism and neoliberal feminism and girl boss feminism and assuming that they're bad. But what is it that makes them bad? And so my basic view in the book is basically that white feminism and a bunch of other, what I refer to as faux feminisms or feminisms for the few. So these are feminisms that prioritize the interests and concerns of elite women, right? So that means affluent women, white women, increasingly cis and straight women, women from the global north, that these feminisms are actually defined, or a helpful way to understand them is in terms of the values they promote. And I think that's in contrast with some of the way you might have heard them discussed, because I think a lot of us have an impulse to just say that white feminism is something that white people believe or something like that. But I really want to move away from the view that what defines white feminism or any of these other bad feminisms is who advances it. And I think this is especially important in a moment where we increasingly see members of disadvantaged groups, including women, as we're about to see, advocating against concerns that benefit women or that benefit people of color. And I want to move toward the idea that these are defined by a misguided value orientation. So to put it really simply, the overall thesis of the book is these faux feminisms are united by the idea that feminism is a movement for individual freedom, and that part of what we need to do to get out of them is to think about them or to think about feminism, like a feminism that we can get behind, needs to understand feminism as a movement for a certain type of equality. Or if you're a scholar who doesn't like the word equality for various reasons, you could call it a movement against inequality. But the deep sort of thought motivating the book is that the right way to understand feminism is as a movement against oppression. Oppression is a type of hierarchy that structurally affects social groups. And once we start to understand it that way, we will be less likely to end up in a type of feminist politics that ends up focusing on the needs and desires of elite women at the expense of other women. So I want to give, the book is really structured around 4 different freedom myths, and then kind of has 2 chapters about what we can do instead. I'm not going to go through everything in the book here. Instead, I want to walk through 2 current examples that might give you an idea of the flavor of the book. And the first one is the example of Representative Nancy Mace. So some of you will likely have seen Representative Mace she's made a lot of headlines recently. Most of what she's made headlines for is being a virulent opponent of the rights of trans people. She is the woman who hung a biological sign in front of the women's bathroom in the Capitol to try to prevent her colleague pictured Sarah McBride from using that bathroom. She also recently got into a conflict about trans rights with Representative Jasmine Crockett, who's in the lower part of the screen, and said to her, "Do you want to take it outside?" So why is this an example of what goes wrong when we think of feminism as a movement for individual freedom? Well, I think the short answer is this. One of the things that I have written about extensively in my academic work is the idea that more advantaged members of oppressed groups, especially, have reasons to use their freedom to do things that will benefit them at the expense of others. And if that's right, if people in advantaged groups or people who are more advantaged within oppressed groups have incentives to use their freedom to throw others under the bus, then we face really big problems for a feminism that is about freedom. Because, to put it simply, if feminism is just about individual freedom, we don't really have a story about why somebody like Nancy Mace is not actually enacting feminism when she does things like vote against Medicaid funding or try to exclude her trans colleague from the bathroom. And in particular, part of why I focused on Nancy Mace is that the idea that feminism is about freedom is particularly kind of dangerous or worrisome right now because we have experienced this real upsurge in women on the political right using language about freedom to justify what they're doing. And that's sort of why I have these 2 quotations from Representative Mace on the top of the slide. These are both things she has said recently. After she was accused of inciting violence against Representative Crockett, she tweeted, "If you want to come at me for going off, here I am. I'm going to go the F off on Jasmine Crockett." Similarly, she repeats over and over again when criticized for transphobic behavior, things like, I'm never going to let anyone tell me what to do. I'm my own woman. Nobody should tell me what to do. And I bring that up partly because if you think about something like the end of the era of the girl boss, this language, "I'm not going to let anyone tell me what to do," or the famous keychain from The Wing, "Women doing whatever the F they want." These are slogans that have a history of use by actual feminists. And so part of why I'm pointing out right-wing women's use of them is to make clear that those slogans are not actually being misused by right-wing women if that is all that feminism is. If feminism is just about freedom, then it is within the rights of somebody like Nancy Mace to say that it's anti-feminist for anybody to tell her that she should be doing something other than what she's already doing. A second quick example of the kind of thing I'm talking about is various attacks on reproductive justice, prenatal health care, access to abortion, et cetera, that have been being put forward by Republicans for many generations and also supported by some Democrats. To give you an example to sort of root it in the contemporary moment, just last week, the Trump administration asked to join the state of South Carolina in a Supreme Court case that was supporting a law that excludes Planned Parenthood from receiving Medicaid funding. And just to be clear, that suit is not about Medicaid funding for abortion, which has already been illegal for a very long time, and real feminists think is a problem. This is about excluding Planned Parenthood from receiving funding from Medicaid for anything, including things like cancer screening and prenatal care. So this is another important example of the limits of choice of freedom feminism, because if you think that feminism is just about individual freedom, sort of one manifestation that might take, and one that it has historically taken, is the idea that abortion and reproductive rights and justice are just about the right to choose whether one wants to continue a pregnancy or not. But women of color and also disabled women have for generations sort of been criticizing this emphasis on choice for a number of reasons that we can talk about more in the Q&A if people want. But one of the ones that I really want to emphasize here is that if feminism is just about individual freedom, it's hard to explain why people deserve active financial support and material support for things like abortion access, for things like being able to continue a pregnancy, for things like assisted reproductive technologies. Because if feminism is just about like, don't let other people tell me what to do, the position you can end up in is okay, no one can tell me what to do, and you might get on board with that and then not understand that part of what's actually necessary to end gender-based oppression and the ways it intersects with a bunch of other oppressions is going to require financial support and awareness of sort of the ways abortion restrictions and reproductive control in general are used to promote social hierarchy. So there's a lot more in the book, but I will stop there and give it over to Cindy and Zeus, and then you'll get to hear a little bit more from them and also a little bit more from me as we get into questions. So I think, Cindy, who's first, Zeus or Cindy? Oh, and let me stop sharing. There we go.
Yeah, it's me. So,
okay.
Hi, everyone. I'm Cindy, and first off, I am so honored to be here, and thank you everyone for attending this event on a Tuesday night. I want to start off with a personal story as to why I found this book to be so engaging. A few years ago, I discussed with my sister whether we like feminism. This was prior to me taking any women's and gender studies course or having any feminist exposure. I told my sister that I don't think I'm a feminist because it felt exclusionary against people of color for its mainstream whitewashing and Western discourses. She shook her head in disapproval and told me that I should be. Fast forward, I'm now pursuing a women's and gender studies minor and can say I'm a feminist. My initial reasons for being opposed to feminism were acknowledged through feminist theorists like Audre Lorde, Bell Hooks, Patricia Hill Collins, Chandra Mohanty, and now Serene Khader. Not only did these theorists state how white feminism is a problem, but also pose solutions towards what feminism should be. Professor Khader's book, Faux Feminism, explains how the idea of freedom for women leads us to perpetuating further inequalities, especially on women of color and the working class. Instead, feminism needs to incorporate intersectionality, which is a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw about how multiple identities can compound on one another that makes the causes of oppression hard to trace, and pose its goal as being against hierarchies, instead for freedom itself. So now I will hand it over to Zeus on his favorite moment of the book.
Hey everyone, my name's Zeus Eugene, and to start, I wanted to say that I'm truly fortunate to be here with Serene and Cindy and those of you watching. Thank you, Serene, for having me not only for having me here this evening, but for expanding my worldviews in ways that are indispensable to the way I think now. I've always held sympathies towards feminism, but I've always had my reservations too. Despite my sympathies, I've felt that much of feminism foregrounded the concerns not of women, but of particular women, namely white and or middle class women who were detached from the lived experiences and the material interests of Black women and women of color, the poor, and racial/ethnic minorities in general. However, like many young college educated men, I went through a sizable shift in my worldview in college. Unlike so many young men, I started to become interested in feminism, viewing the recent Roe verdict as a sort of horrible omen. I felt that something had gone seriously awry and that I needed to needed to take another look at this tradition. Instead of being radicalized towards a politics of anti-feminism, I veered in the opposite direction. So, reading this book, which is about the misconceptions which haunt mainstream white corporate feminism, felt like a direct response after I'd already been won over by the increasing number of writings by or about women, along with Serene's Philosophy of Feminism seminar. In addition to the book's mission, I appreciate the honesty about particular kinds of high-profile feminism. The way that it addresses these pitfalls are useful not only to feminists, but to other people who have much to gain from feminist thought and politics.
And I think the first question is yours too, Zeus, if you want to ask.
Oh yeah, it is my As you point out, whenever someone levies a critique against a particular feature of a culture or society, someone else is bound to interject, warning the first person not to violate the cultural autonomy of that culture/society. You've dedicated an entire chapter to addressing the culture myth, or the idea that some cultures are backward and war-torn, which warrant more or at least justify extreme intervention on the part of the culturally enlightened West. But when cultures do exhibit patriarchy, how might feminists or even members of the global community respond without falling into the pitfalls of the culture myth?
Thank you so much for the question, Zeus. Also, because I think it speaks to something that is very me about the book, and I think something that also makes the book different from a lot of other books that exist in this space. So folks who know me will, especially who know my academic brand, will probably associate me with scholarship about the Global South and colonialism. And so that is something that I bring to this book. And maybe I'll say a little bit about what the culture myth that Zeus is referencing is, and then kind of directly answer the question. So one of the things that I argue in the book is that a particularly dark face of freedom feminism, and a face that links freedom feminism very deeply with white supremacy, and also to some extent with bad forms of capitalism, is the idea that women, and in particular kind of other women, are oppressed by their cultures. So one kind of everyday way you might think about feminism is that, and I think you hear in people's everyday discussions of feminism, is that patriarchy, the form that patriarchy takes is the form of sort of cultural restrictions on what we can do, or cultural dictates about what we should do. And one thing that people often say as a result of thinking that is that what feminism is about is freeing women from their cultures, and that women would be better off without their cultures. And I could say a lot more about this, but one of the things that I claim in the book is that part of the legacy of what I call the Enlightenment teleological narrative in this book, and my last one, is the idea that, and I think most people in the West are kind of unconsciously raised believing some version of this, which is the idea that so everyone kind of started out barbaric, primitive, patriarchal, whatever, and that people in the West have evolved out of this state of being, and people in the global South and Black and brown people are still kind of stuck in tradition. And so if you kind of approach the idea that feminism is about freedom, and you approach it with this set of assumptions about what the world is like in the background, what you end up with is a lot of policies and strategies that claim to be feminist, but actually their main function ends up being to promote racism, or to separate like Black and brown women from their communities. So I give a bunch of examples of this in the book. One of them is, for example, the number of hijab bans that have arisen throughout Europe and North America, that are very often justified by those who support them by claiming that women would be better off without their relationship to Islam or something like that. In fact, there are many, many, many more countries and localities in the world where it is illegal to wear hijab now than where it is legally required to wear hijab. So Zeus kind of is asking, now that I've sort of laid out what the culture myth is, he's asking like, what can be done about patriarchal practices or sexism in other places, given that we don't want to act as though the culture myth is true. And I give a lot of different answers to that in the book. But I think one short answer is to stop thinking that the main drivers of gender-based oppression in the lives of Black and brown women and women in the global South are their cultures, and to start recognizing instead the ways in which capitalism and white supremacy and imperialism really play a role in causing gender-based oppression. So just to give one quick example of this, I feel like if I were able to talk to you in a room, I would ask you, like, what are some issues affecting women in the global South? And you would probably come back with things about child marriage, female genital cutting, etc. One question that letting go of the culture myth allows us to ask is, well, like, why are these the issues that come to mind when we think about oppression of women in the global South? And why are things like abuse by Northern corporations not one of the things that first come to mind? So one of the things I talk about in the book is how sexual abuse is systematically used by Northern corporations in order to secure women as docile workers in order to claim their land. I also talk extensively about how environmental degradation brought about by Northern corporations is a huge cause of gender-based oppression for women in the global South, because environmental degradation makes it the case, for example, that they have to spend more hours doing things like collecting water and fuel, because if the water that you're drinking is polluted and now you have to walk 5 more miles to be able to get water that isn't, this contributes to your gendered labor burdens. So yeah, I think one answer to your question, Zeus, about what could be done instead of the culture myth is focus activist energy on causes of gender-based oppression that are not only culturally driven, including things like the ways that multinational corporations are purveyors of gender-based oppression. And I talk in the book especially about, because the last 2 sections of the book try to kind of be positive sections, I talk about some indigenous women from Guatemala who are suing a mining company that was owned by Canada and has now been transferred to Switzerland, because this is how these things work in an international court. And I also talk about the group, the activist group ActionAid, that has an ongoing fight for transnational corporate accountability as a feminist fight. Cindy, I think it's you.
So going back to my initial negative judgment on feminism, that first reaction reflected the idea of feminists as enemies of women. People believe feminists say to not judge women for their choices and only to respect them. The quote, "I support women's rights and women's wrongs." That is part of the judgment myth. Essentially, we leave people alone, which is known as negative freedom. This idea does not come out of nowhere. As stated from your book, the idea of leaving alone and being left alone has roots in the American psyche. This deeper root of the judgment myth lies in the political philosophy known as liberalism. Can you first please define what liberalism is and how it explains and connects with the judgment myth and the concept of freedom overall?
Thank you for this question, Cindy. And one thing, before I answer it, I also want to say that something, and I want to say this especially kind of for people more of my generation or older in the room. One of the things that has been most interesting to me in promoting this book out in the world is hearing from many people who are younger than me, who say that they're kind of they had initial, and Zeus said a version of this too, that like they had initial negative judgments about feminism that weren't coming from conservatism, but that really were coming from the idea that feminism was really about being a girl boss, or focusing only on what the women in the most elite group wanted. So thank you for sharing your story. Okay, so the judgment myth. One of the myths that I try to unpack in the book is the idea that feminism is about refusing to judge other women. And I think I make a joke at the beginning that like almost any discussion of feminism you read online will eventually, like a woman can say she does anything, or like a woman eats a salad, a woman becomes a stay-at-home mom, a woman wears makeup, a woman doesn't wear makeup, right? Like the initial place that the place that the conversation ends up very quickly is somebody saying this action is feminist, somebody saying this action is not feminist, and then somebody ending the conversation by being like, don't you know feminism is just about not judging women, so we shouldn't be having this conversation in the first place. Um, and so, yeah, oh, were you going to say something, Cindy? No, okay. Please feel free to chime in if you want to go back and forth at all. So Cindy's asking sort of what are like the deep philosophical roots of the judgment myth. Well, one of the things I want to say is that they're deeply related to this concept called negative freedom, that is really prevalent in the Western political imaginary, and especially in the American political imaginary, which is the idea that feminism is, or that freedom is about not being told what to do. And I think you can really hear echoes of that in the Nancy Mace quotes that I read at the beginning, right? Like, I'm not going to let anybody tell me what to do. One of the things I'm trying to get the audience to see in kind of pointing out the relationship between no one can tell me what to do and negative freedom is to get people to see that like that language is actually like not a language that most people who are feminists usually sort of see themselves as allied with. Like I mean, do you really want to have the same notion of freedom that people who think that like society should be run by a laissez-faire capitalism have, right? Like, do you really want to think that other people or the government intervening in your life is always or necessarily sort of a bad thing? So part of why I point out the connection to capitalism is just to sort of lay bare for people, like, really, like, is this the side you're on? Are you on the side that says that that our mutual involvement with each other is always kind of a bad thing that gets in the way, instead of thinking that mutual support and solidarity can really have value. One of the things I really try to argue in the judgment myth chapter is that the whole idea that feminism is about not judging other women is really like, it has its roots in a right-wing strategy against feminism in the 1990s. And part of why that strategy was somewhat effective, and part of why the right sort of pursued this strategy, was to um, make it difficult for feminists to fight against the system, right? Like, if you think that feminism is just about individuals refusing to judge each other, then individuals will put all of their attention into their personal choices and each other's personal choices, instead of to fighting the system that is actually adversely affecting all of us. And so the story I tell about this being a tactic from the 90s is about something called the Mommy Wars, that older listeners are familiar with. But basically, it seems like in the early 1990s, feminists were actually having a lot of public and political success. This is the era that I grew up in, so I can vouch for sort of growing up in a time period where, I was really kind of surrounded by messaging that was like, girls can do anything. There was very quickly a right-wing backlash against that. And one of the strategies of the backlash was, and that was highly effective, was to create this idea that feminists are like career women who hate stay-at-home moms. And this is to this day, you guys probably have in your mind that feminists are like these judgmental people that like are always telling other people what to do. I think this is really a relic of this era, when the right thought it was really effective to tell women who had caregiving responsibilities, like me, right? Like the folks who are in this call know that my child was in the room at the beginning, and she came in a minute in the middle too. But that women who have caregiving responsibility, having caregiving responsibilities is somehow incompatible with feminism, and feminists hate people who are caregivers. But look, we can spend forever like talking about whether people should choose to be stay-at-home moms or whether people should choose to be career women, which, by the way, are only choices that are really available to people with a certain level of economic affluence anyway, because I mean, you can't really be a stay-at-home mom if you don't have any money that is coming in from work that our economy values. But the truth is, like, both of these are bad options, right? Like, if the only way that you can, be economically stable and be a caregiver, is like, or let me put it this way, there is no way to be economically stable and be a caregiver unless you are quite affluent. And even if you are quite affluent, like, you will end up, if you're a caregiver, overburdened or overtired in some kind of way. And so I'm bringing that up in relation to the judgment myth because it's like the only solution to solve this supposed fight about stay-at-home moms and working moms judging each other is to change the menu of options that are available to women, and to caregivers. But if you end up spending all your political time instead, kind of talking about whether we should judge people for what they chose from a menu that was already bad, then we end up not devoting our political attention to changing the menu.
And well, I just want to say that was extremely insightful.
Oh, thank you. Your questions are extremely insightful also.
But kind of leading off of that point, I want to ask about the restriction myth. With the restriction myth, one gets the impression that oppression is reducible to external or maybe internal restrictions like internalized belief, um, external barriers bearing down on individuals. But as you point out, so much of oppression is about granting possibilities which are desirable or beneficial to some by granting other less than beneficial or desirable possibilities and outcomes to others. Often, patriarchal society also grants less than desirable possibilities and outcomes to other men because they, as individuals, do not fit the standard or predominant concept of masculinity. In this regard, I'm thinking of the section where you bring up Elliot Rogers, the UC Santa Barbara mass shooter from I think maybe a decade ago or something like that.
Yeah.
A long time ago.
I think it's 2014, which
Oh, okay.
is probably making you and not just me feel old.
Yeah, yeah. Now that you said that, I feel very old. Um, it's easy to
I'm sorry. Go
um,
ahead, sorry.
it's easy to dispatch the bad faith arguer, often a man who is similarly situated to Rogers in some way, by saying that whatever limitations they face are due to the patriarchy for the benefit of other men. In this regard, I'm thinking of oof, I'm having a blank, but there's a particular reading from your class that I'm thinking of on oppression.
You're probably thinking of Fry.
Yes, Marlon Fry. Thank you. Um, does having an explicit account of the restriction myth have a role in swaying men from the kind of misogyny that Elliot Robert displayed? If so, how might one contextualize these limitations in men's lives in ways that steer them towards feminism/feminist organizing?
This is such a rich question. I'm going to just try to give shorter answers so we can get through what we need to get through. So excuse me if the answer is not complete. But what about incels? I want to say that's the first part of the question. So the restriction myth is the idea that the only way that patriarchy harms us is by restricting us or telling us what to do. And the way that incels kind of come up in the book is that they are often complaining about also being victims of what patriarchy tells them what to do, right? Like they're saying, I don't, I can't, I used to be able to sort of live in a time where I could not have to care about how I looked. And now I'm being like okay. They're saying that the patriarchy also has unreasonable standards for them, and that those standards are increasingly unreasonable. So one of the things I try to say about the case of incels is that I think, a kind of straightforward case of one where there are restrictions, but who the restrictions are, but being restricted and not benefiting from those restrictions are two separate things. So, yes, men face increasing restrictions on what their appearance is supposed to look like, but incels are claiming that what these restrictions do to them is take away the right to kind of control and own women. So the restrictions that they're railing against are actually restrictions that give men advantages over women. Now, Zeus is asking, though, like, are there ways in which thinking about the restriction myth can help us think about ways to get men more involved in feminism, more critical of their gender role? And I think one of the things I try to do in the book is talk about ways in which understanding the restriction myth and criticizing the freedom myth and understanding feminism as opposition to hierarchy actually includes a lot of really interesting activist possibilities for non-elite men. And one of the examples that I give is the example of the Purna School for Girls in India, which is, and then they made the Purna School for Boys, which is run by this kind of radical feminist educator. And basically the message that that school tries to send to these poor Dalit boys in India is, well, like, how is this message about how you should be a provider working for you? Like, how is it working for you in a society where you don't have economic opportunities and you face a bunch of caste-based discrimination? Like, wouldn't it be better for you to think about you and the women in your life as on the same team instead of as trying to measure yourself against this ideal of masculinity that is also oppressive to you? So I think there's a lot of possibilities once you recognize feminism as sort of aligned with opposition to capitalism, white supremacy, et cetera, for um, making non-elite men recognize that criticism of patriarchy is in their interests too.
That was a phenomenal answer. So now we're moving on to the individualism myth. So emotional labor has been a popular term nowadays, as it is about the undervalued and unacknowledged labor that most women do, typically in households. Debated solutions have been to pay for emotional labor or for it to be recognized as a skill. How has freedom feminism's individualistic nature make it seem like emotional labor is a new concern and contributes to the fact that it has not been solved? How are men part of this problem with the individualism myth?
Yeah, so to give a short answer to that question that maybe kind of follows on the last one, I think one real downside of freedom feminism is thinking that feminism is about empowering women, but men don't need to change in order for us to actually arrive at feminist change. And so when you think about what is actually going on around the gender division of labor, what you realize is that freedom feminism has kind of given us a world where women are working outside the home and inside the home, right? Like, because your freedom is enhanced by pursuing a career, and where women are kind of exhausted to the point of being driven into the ground, and where men are, the data really show men in general are not doing what they need to be doing to get near equality. Just to give one example, and I go through a bunch of data in the book. Today, the average American woman does 2 more hours a day of housework than the average man. And a lot of the data about this kind of shows that in many cases, men don't care. They're kind of aware that this is going on and they say they can't do it, or, they just need more leisure time. Um, and so I think that kind of fits with the question that Zeus asked too, because part of one of the things that freedom feminism is really missing is an understanding of the idea that to achieve something like gender equality or gender equity, like, men have to change. And then there's this other kind of dark side of freedom feminism that I think is really important to, and the individualism myth that is really important to understanding how it affects non-elite women, which is that because some people want to talk about the gender division of labor or like oppression through care work as though it's only caused by men not doing their share. But it's also caused by this kind of deeper thing of our societies refusing to give economic value to or economically support the labor that women have traditionally done for free, the labor of caring for children, the labor of caring for elders, housework, etc. And this is really deeply connected with the ways in which freedom feminism ends up serving elite women, because the most of the work that I described won't go away, right? Like, babies, like, are always going to need to be cared for, right? Like, they're not born like baby deer need to be taken care of too, but they're not born like being able to stand up and walk around by themselves, right? Like we're a species that needs a lot of care. And so what happens when women from the upper and middle classes start kind of pursuing freedom by working outside of the home is that somebody else needs to do this work. And de facto, what that means is that women in the upper middle classes pass the work on to more vulnerable women, right? Like women of color, immigrant women, poor women. And then, just to be clear, right, like the problem doesn't stop there because these women usually also have caregiving responsibilities of their own. And so they have to pass the labor on to something else to the point that there's something that scholars have referred to as like a global heart transplant or a global care deficit in which now the North is kind of draining the global South of caregivers who themselves have left their children at home in the care of other women. So another reason we need to not think about feminism as about individual freedom, if we really care about all women and gender expansive people, is that the only way to end this problem is going to be to actively support care work, not just to say that people need to be left alone. And I think we can now do a Q&A with the audience. I think that's the end of our list.
Fantastic. Thank you for both walking us through the book so we can get a better appreciation of it, but also engaging us in conversation and forcing us to think through these issues. My name is Gaston Alonso. I'm the director of the Wolf Institute. I'm going to be moderating the questions and answers. Please, if you have questions for Cindy, for Suze, for Serene, raise your hands or you can put them in the chat and I'll read them. Let's keep that conversation sort of moving forward. And perhaps while people type out their questions on the chat or think them through, Serene, I had a question about the title. I'm wondering why the title and the subtitle, and what has been the reception of it.
Why the title and why the subtitle? So one thing I'll share, because I like to be very open about what it was like to write a book for a non-academic audience. One of the things is that the title is like largely a marketing decision. And so Faux Feminism was actually not even a title that I came up with, but it was a title that multiple people suggested to me at different times across reading the book. And so I thought, if multiple people are saying this, it must be right. In terms of the subtitle, so the subtitle is a little bit deceiving because it makes it sound like the book is only about white feminism. And of course, the book is really about a bunch of different types of elite feminism. And so the struggle there was just, with trying to use a term that people were familiar with, that was in the popular imaginary, and that also is a term that people search for on the internet. One thing I will say that I didn't anticipate is that this, in terms of the reception, which has been, mostly lovely and helpful, but the book launched just a couple days before the election. And so one thing that I didn't expect is that in the post-election climate, the term white feminism was going to read like a call out to a lot of people, which it was not intended to be. But you can't control one thing I have learned from talking to people about selling books is no one knows what's going to happen or sort of how people are going to react. And I didn't know that that was going to be the political moment that the book would launch into, but so it was.
Great. And we have a question from Janet and from Benjamin. So let's go to Janet first.
Hi, thanks, Serene.
Thank you,
I
Janet.
really loved the way that you crystallized, I think a very digestible way, lots of the critiques of what you've called white or freedom feminism or choice feminism or liberal feminism. I'm a feminist political scientist and a scholar of social movements. And so what I'm wondering is, where is this feminism that you're talking about? Because, when I teach feminist theory, like so much of feminism, or even like today, I've been teaching class, we're teaching Uma Narayan's critique of post-colonial feminists. So like, I don't actually see this feminism in what I do anymore, I guess. So where is it that you found this feminism still operating? And how do we know? I mean, so much like the characters you like, they're not feminist, like, or at least I don't think they're feminist. So what is this popular feminism and where do we find it?
Are you asking where we see the bad feminism or where we see the good feminism?
The bad feminism that you're critiquing, where is that? Like, not the right wing like imitations, but are there still white freedom feminists who are this unreflective and unthoughtful? And where are they? What are the institutions or the practices or online, or where do you find them?
So one of the things I'm really trying to argue against in the book, and I think also I have a couple of conversations with Sophie Lewis coming up also about her book, Enemy Feminism. So I think both of us are putting our finger on something that I think is very real right now, which is that I don't think we get to restrict the use of the term feminism to people that we like, right? Like, what feminism means will sort of depend on who gets a hold of it and kind of how they end up building movements. And so I know a lot of people want to react by being like, Nancy Mace isn't a feminist, but I think at the end of the day, like, what is the difference between what she's saying and what the girl boss is saying? And how many people and how many of us kind of come into feminism or inadvertently holding on to these same types of beliefs. So the book actually opens with the story of my falling into white feminism. And the story is about realizing that I'm reading my child the same book that Amy Coney Barrett is referencing, because even though I have all of these, more reconstructed beliefs about what feminism is, like how it's actually translating into the things that I'm teaching my children is about how feminism is about how you can't not be like no one can tell you that you can't be an astronaut or something like that. I think maybe one of the I know you're saying you're a scholar of social movement. So I think one way to maybe think about what I'm saying here is that these are ideas that that are very easy to fall into because they underpin a lot of American and Western culture. And even if people don't actively espouse those ideas, they often end up drawing on arguments from them. So this "don't tell me what to do" argument, is everywhere, even among people who otherwise have good politics. But another way to look at it too is that, like, what do movements fight for and what's the shape of them? Like, I guarantee you that if you go and ask like your everyday feminist person, the stuff about colonial, I mean, they will tell me that the issues facing women in the global South are child marriage and female genital cutting, right? Like, it's not, and they might know, and this is part of the reason I wrote the book, like they might know something about how if somebody told them that that was a white feminist thing to do, that they shouldn't do it. But that's different from having a transformed concept of what your goals are kind of affect what your agenda is. So I mean, I think we could talk about this a lot more, but that's my sort of initial answer.
Great. And let's go to Benjamin.
Hey, can you hear me all right?
Yes.
All right, awesome. First of all, Serene, Dr. Khader or Professor Khader?
Serene is fine.
Serene. Wonderful, wonderful discussion, and I really enjoyed hearing your explanation of your book. Cindy, wonderful job, and Eugene, Zeus, wonderful job as well with your questions and comments. So my name is Benjamin Stewart, and I wanted to kind of just say thank you for the discussion also, and then kind of try to figure out how to understand feminism and its complexities, because just like any other cultural movement, any other just kind of culture in general, it's not it's not a monolithic So, growing up, I never really had the discussion with my mother or my grandparents or anything like that about feminism because it wasn't like something that we talked about in the household. I grew up in Missouri, in a black family. Feminism was like something that wasn't really on our plate. Not that it did exist, but I often wonder how you translate the experiences and the kind of um qualitative data that you're getting from all of these different conversations, especially when you're talking about global South. Because when you're talking about global South, in my mind, I'm thinking of these countries below the equator with colored, you know, people of color, individuals that my family can relate to because we are part of the diaspora that kind of comes from in that area as well. So when you're talking about like feminism and how this faux feminism from the northern global I guess feminist movement, it's like interesting to hear that on a worldwide scale and not just like a civil rights in the US kind of scale. And I think it's important to make that distinction because whether you're black, brown, you're from Asian countries, all the feminism means so many different things in that particular aspect. So I just wanted to kind of ask you, how do you have those conversations with people whose idea of feminism, their philosophy of feminism, just out is so outright different from the experiences in all these other different places?
Are you a qualitative researcher
Yep.
yourself?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So I'm asking too not to make this be too academic because part of my reaction is like, well, I'm a philosopher and qualitative researchers may just not what I do, right? I mean, and that is especially in my last book, like Decolonizing Universalism, a lot of what I try to do is draw like normative conclusions from a large set of ethnographic conversations. So I think one thing you might be asking is sort of, people use a lot of different moral languages to understand the movements that they're involved in. And sometimes they use the word feminism and sometimes they don't. Um, and I guess I'll say, um, I'm less interested in, like, I'm interested in sort of understanding what this set of shared moral goals, kind of people and political goals people have developed across borders. And to me, the real question is like, does your movement identify like structural gender-based oppression as an issue? If it does, then I think it's worthy of being called a feminist movement. If it doesn't, then I think we might understand it as something else. And it does follow from that like some people who call themselves feminists aren't feminists, which is, part of why I've come out with this. I think I'm front and center with that by using the term faux feminism. um, but um, I do want to say that there's some kind of continuity among movements that don't always use the same terminology if the injustice that they're talking about in the world is similar.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much. That's kind of what I was looking for because obviously, everybody's experience is not the same as somebody else's experience. And
No, and I do think, I mean, especially for undergraduate students in the room, I think maybe this part of the conversation is useful to hear, like, people with different disciplines and trainings, like we will approach questions differently. And I think one of the values of being a qualitative researcher, which I respect so much, is like you really get the details of how people understand themselves. And there's something so rich and important about that. But then I, as a philosopher, I think the value of what I do is that like there's sometimes real value with taking a sort of very general level view. And I actually think sometimes that's politically important because in the case of feminism, we're fighting a system and a connected system of oppressions that's global. So we eventually need to be able to make connections that transcend the local level in order to do that. But thank you for your question.
yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Great. Let's go over to the chat and then come back to Sophia and close out with Anastasia's question in the chat. And there is an observation in the chat. Not a question, but an observation. The idea that the right pitted feminists and women against each other is so true. I was there, the 90s. Evermore, this dynamic still applies to all the walks of liberal political life and many of the movements that suffer from it, which I think points to the urgency of your book and the conversation that we're having. And then Corey asked a question. Is there an idea of freedom that can be redeemed for feminism? I'm thinking of two possibilities. One is the old idea of, quote, equal freedom for all. The idea of freedom doesn't entail giving our blessings to every woman, just doing her own thing, but instead requires creating a society where everyone has as much freedom as is consistent with the freedom of others. The other idea I was wondering about is the radical Republican idea of freedom as non-domination or absence of domination. Would that offer more possibilities than the idea of negative freedom that you're describing, or is it equally problematic?
Great. So Corey is asking the question that all political philosophers ask. So there's a lot more that I could say about this. Let me think of kind of what's fast and will make sense for this audience. And then Corey, you and I can also talk more at another time if you want. So Professor Robin is basically asking, like, I'm really focused on, like, I'm saying freedom is really not what feminism is about, but I'm really focused on this particular subspecies of freedom, which is negative freedom, which is the idea that freedom is about not having other people tell you what to do. And a common response that political theorists and philosophers will give is, well, that's not the only understanding of freedom. What if you understand freedom as something like the ability to live a good life, or which is kind of the first thing that Professor Robin lists, or you understand it as freedom from being dominated by others. So I have, okay, to the first one, to both questions, I'll just answer, like, as a first pass, this is kind of a popular book, and I really worry about our obsession with redeeming the ideal of freedom, because I think that in the American political context, I'm actually just not sure that the term freedom is reclaimable from the way that negative freedom kind of dominates the discourse. But I also tend to think, and a lot of my academic career is about this, is like, why does freedom have to be the only value? Like, there are other good things in life and values that are worth pursuing. And it's important for people who are against oppression to name and fight for those other things. And so I will just say, in answer to maybe the second version, I actually think non-domination is like a way of renaming equality as freedom. And that frustrates me, right? If the real issue is nobody, like, we should live in a world where nobody has the kind of control that like a master has over a servant, then it seems like to me the real deep issue is partly about respecting the equal standing of persons, and relabeling that freedom, I think, is actually missing something important. And then I'll say, kind of as a last thing, which I think will be cryptic to most people, but I think I've spent a lot of my career making various arguments about why focusing on positive freedom is, which is the first definition that Professor Robin laid out, ends up being bad for movements against oppression. Here's the basic reason. The positive freedom view ends up saying something like, if your choices are really limited, then you're not free. And that ends up really bothering me, because I think it ends up requiring us to draw kind of perverse, undesirable judgments about agency that people exercise when they have very limited choices. So if you aren't really making your own choices when your conditions are bad, then where's the story for us to tell about why the choices that you make, even when your conditions are really bad, matter?
Fantastic. Let's go to Sophia, and then we'll end with Anastasia's question in the chat.
Thanks again for a great conversation. Also to Zeus and Cindy. I have a question about writing a trade book, or writing a book for a more popular audience. that was inspired by your answer to Janet's question, actually, because I felt like in that answer of where is this bad feminism or faux feminism located right now? A lot of it sounded like things that are buzzwords and easy to hold on to and that like really stay in the popular imagination, like the idea of the girl boss or the mommy wars, and that are those things that are still circulating in popular culture and popular conversations that if we're in a feminist political science class or a feminist philosophy class are not the things that people identifying as feminists are saying. And so I was wondering if that informed the way that you thought about writing for a popular audience, and if you were thinking about how to create those sort of easy to hold on to portable ideas or images for your readers of, you know, what this alternative vision of a better feminism is.
Yeah, I love this question. Before I answer it, Cindy or Zeus, do you want to jump in about anything about the book in relation to this question or the last three questions? No pressure to, but if you do, feel free. Okay, but please jump in at any time. Yeah, so I love this question, and I think it really speaks to part of why the book is written the way that it is. Academics are always going to quibble with it. But one of the choices I made in writing a trade book is like, am I going to talk about how like actual people see and talk about the world, or am I going to talk about the way that academics have carved the world and created labels for these different kinds of feminism, blah, blah, blah. And I guess I really think, and I think this came up partly in my response to Janet's question, that the way that people understand feminism does not really map up onto scholarly debates. And so, and you can't, I really had, I mean, when you're writing a trade book, like you're always making choices, right? About like what's going to keep people want to keep reading and what is like more authentic to the scholarly debates. And I think there are always trade-offs there. And I really chose to say like, I'm going to stay close to kind of what I hear people saying out in the world, and also what the movements that are out in the world are saying, and also like what I hear people say in activist meetings and what I hear students say when they come to my class. And one thing I think is like so telling, even in response to kind of Janet's question, is like, I often hear people say no one believes this, but then I often hear young people saying, well, this is what I thought feminism was, right? And what Cindy and Zeus both said at the beginning, which is like, I was kind of turned off by feminism for lefty reasons, I think it's maybe some good evidence that these ideas are out there. So yeah, I think there just is a trade-off between following the contours of an academic conversation and speaking to what's actually going on in the world. And that if you want to write a trade book, you have to just accept that there are some trade-offs there. And then maybe to say something a little spicier, I actually don't like the way that the academic conversation has parsed a lot of these issues. And so, like, especially the focus on like, and this is why I kind of go for the value focus in the book, but like the focus on, like, I think the academic conversation actually has more buzzwords in it, to be honest, than the popular discourse does. Like, people just repeat the word intersectionality over and over again without really deeply thinking about what it means. Or, you know, they offer these kind of one-off notes that are just like, I'm writing from a place of privilege, and now I'm going to just go say all the same things that I would have otherwise said. So yeah, that's maybe a short answer, or a longish answer, but I could talk about this forever, but that's one answer to your question. Thanks, Sophia.
Let's close out on Anastasia's question just because of the time, but there is another fantastic and very thoughtful and deep question in the chat that I just wanted to point to. But Anastasia says, kind of an add-on to what Professor Johnson's saying, There's recently been a controversial influencer who promoted a woman-only gym, promoted a gym that was a safe space for everyone, and then later charged and then refused admission to trans women and athletes. I know you partially addressed this in the earlier part of your talk, but what are your thoughts regarding how this faux feminism is expressed in social media and affects gender expression and the creation of these so-called, quote, safe spaces?
Yeah, great question, and a very important question for our moment. So I think one of the real um, reasons it's valuable to think about oppression as a system, um, and to think about it as affecting entire groups of people, is that it helps us move the conversation a little bit farther away from individual people and their own experiences of oppression, which especially when we're talking about privileged people, sort of risk having them put themselves in the center. And instead, we can think about like, how do the structures work? Um, and like, what are the forces that keep the structures in place? So I think that once we think about how the structure that is patriarchy or gender-based oppression actually works, it's very obvious that trans people are like serious victims of this system. And in particular that trans women are. Um, and when I say the data bear that out, I mean, there's a lot to say here, but one is, of course, that, I mean, in case people are not aware, right, like trans women are especially likely to be victims of things like sexual assault and abuse. Additionally, there's a lot of feminist writing and activism around the idea that policing the gender binary is a tool of patriarchy, right? And this goes back at least 50 years. The idea that, like, well, I mean, part of the importance of enforcing the gender binary is so that men, this is a simplistic way of putting it, right? But like that the men at the top have clear indicators of who they should be able to subjugate and how. One of the movements that I think is really amazing on this topic, and actually it's a wonderful thing to close on, it's a feminist movement that I think is especially helpful for these times because it's a movement that also kind of grew in a moment and in a context of right-wing authoritarianism, is the movement Ni Una Menos in Argentina. Actually, watch out in the next few days because the LA Review of Books will run a story by my friend and fellow philosopher Amy Reed Sandoval about what feminists in the US can learn from Ni Una Menos. But Ni Una Menos is a movement that began as a movement against femicide, right? Like the rampant killing of women. And then they kind of said, like, well, when we look around at the world, who is a victim of patriarchal violence? And it became clear very quickly that the using of like that trans people were disproportionate victims of this violence enforced on women. The way there's a really wonderful Latin American anthropologist, Rita Segato, and she has this wonderful quote about it, which says, like, what does femicide do? Well, it teaches through what she calls a pedagogy of cruelty that you will be what the patriarchy wants you to be, or you will be nothing. So I think part of the key to fighting against these types of arguments is to actually look very closely at how patriarchy works and the way that the policing of queer and trans bodies is part of the same system that causes the subjugation of women. Even if it also, I mean, I'll make a nerdy philosophy point, it may also have some autonomy from that system, but it also works as an enforcer of the system. And you just have to look around to see if that's the case.
Fantastic. Clearly that people want to continue that conversation, but we are out of time. And so I want to first thank Serene for this book. It is smart, it is engaged, and it's also really, really nicely written. It is a joy to read. So go get it. Right. I also want to thank Serene for giving us a feminism that is about political commitments and not identity. As a feminist, activist and theorist Barbara Smith, Head Scholar 2023, always says, it's not about who you are, it's about where you're at. That's a side note. Barbara will be at Brooklyn College on April 1st as part of HES. Right? A feminism that is about being in the world in solidarity, in collective movement with the oppressed, right? And I think that's a feminism that can serve as, a counterbalance to these times, right? And as a way forward. So thank you so much for giving us that. And thank you, Cindy and Suze and Serene, for engaging us in conversation, for your analysis, your smarts, your vision. And then thank you to everyone who joined us for this conversation. Keep the conversation moving forward. The world needs that right now. I want to invite you all to join us at their next book events. The link is in the chat. I want to invite you to join to follow the Wolf Institute on Instagram. The link is in the chat. And then I want to invite you to continue this conversation during HES Week, April 1st through the 4th with Melissa Mary at Brooklyn College, and the link is in the chat. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Good evening.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you especially Cindy and Zeus.